At the Nuremberg trials in 1946, one defendant stood apart from the others in the prisoner's dock through a performance so compelling and so carefully calibrated that it would shape his historical legacy for decades and allow him to escape the hangman's noose that claimed most of his co-defendants. Albert Speer, Hitler's personal architect and Minister of Armaments, who acknowledged general responsibility for Nazi crimes while simultaneously denying specific knowledge of the Holocaust, who presented himself as the reasonable technocrat who had been seduced by Hitler's charisma and had remained ignorant of the regime's worst atrocities because he was too focused on architectural plans and production statistics to notice that the buildings he designed and the weapons he produced were serving systematic genocide. The judges believed him. The prosecutors accepted his carefully constructed narrative of ignorant complicity, and he received 20 years imprisonment rather than execution, emerging from Spandau prison in 1966 to write memoirs that cemented his self-created image as the Nazi who said sorry, as the cultured intellectual who had made terrible mistakes, but who possessed the moral clarity and honesty that other Nazi leaders lacked, as someone fundamentally different from the thugs and fanatics who surrounded Hitler. The performance was brilliant, and it was entirely fraudulent, a final architectural achievement more sophisticated than any building he ever designed. The construction of a false self and a sanitized history that allowed him to preserve his vanity and his self-image as a man of culture and intelligence, while evading full accountability for crimes that he had not merely enabled through passive ignorance, but had actively facilitated through his organizational genius and his willing use of slave labor and his complete subordination of human welfare to aesthetic vision and technical efficiency. Welcome to Forgotten Minds. Today we examine Albert Speer, the man who proved that education and cultural sophistication and aesthetic sensibility provide no protection against complicity in atrocity. That intelligence and technical brilliance can be devoted entirely to evil purposes, while the perpetrator maintains an internal narrative of innocence and professional dedication. And that the most dangerous enablers of genocide are often not the obvious fanatics, but the cultured technocrats who transform moral catastrophe into problems of logistics and efficiency, and who genuinely believe their own lies about ignorance and limited responsibility, because confronting the truth would shatter the self-concept they have constructed so carefully. But first, if you like this exploration of the human mind, please leave a like and subscribe to Forgotten Minds. It helps me continue this work. There's much darker truth still ahead. Thank you. Albert Speer was born on March 19th, 1905, into an upper-middle-class family in Mannheim, raised in an environment of books and culture and professional respectability, where architecture was understood as high art rather than mere construction, where aesthetic judgment and refined taste were markers of civilization and superiority. He studied architecture in Karlsruhe, Munich, and Berlin, was mentored by Heinrich Tessenow, whose neoclassical aesthetic and emphasis on monumental simplicity would profoundly influence Speer's own architectural vision. And by his mid-20s, had established himself as a promising young architect with technical skill and sophisticated understanding of spatial design and architectural history. His entry into Nazi circles came through aesthetic affinity rather than ideological conviction, through his attendance at a Nazi rally in 1931, where he was captivated not by the political message, but by the theatrical spectacle, by the staging and the lighting and the choreography of mass emotion that he recognized as a form of architectural manipulation of space and human movement and perception. When he met Hitler shortly after joining the party in 1931, he discovered someone who shared his passion for architecture and monumental design, who could discuss building plans for hours with genuine knowledge and strong opinions, who offered him something that no amount of academic success or professional achievement had provided. A client with unlimited resources and grandiose ambitions, who would allow him to design and build on a scale that no conventional architectural career could ever offer. The relationship between Hitler and Speer was built on mutual narcissistic supply. Hitler found in Speer the cultured, educated architect who could translate his megalomaniacal visions into concrete plans and who treated him as an artistic peer rather than as an uneducated demagogue, while Speer found in Hitler the patron who would make him the most important architect in Germany and who would provide opportunities to design buildings that would stand for millennia as monuments to German greatness and to Speer's own genius. The foundation of their bond was aesthetic rather than ideological, or rather, the aesthetic was the ideology for Speer, whose entire moral framework had become subordinated to questions of beauty and monumentality and architectural legacy, who could rationalize any political position or compromise any ethical principle if it served his architectural ambitions. His early work for the regime involved designing the settings for Nazi spectacles, creating the theatrical backdrops against which Hitler performed his rallies and speeches. And Speer approached this work with sophisticated understanding of how architecture shapes emotion and behavior. The Cathedral of Light at the Nuremberg rallies, where 130 anti-aircraft searchlights created vertical columns extending miles into the night sky, was pure theatrical manipulation designed to produce feelings of transcendence and insignificance simultaneously, to make individuals feel small before the regime's power, while also feeling elevated by their participation in something vast and eternal. The effect was architectural in the deepest sense, using light and space to construct an environment that overrode rational thought and created emotional states conducive to loyalty and submission. When Fritz Todt died in a plane crash in February 1942 and Speer was appointed to replace him as Minister of Armaments and War Production, he transitioned from architect designing buildings to technocrat organizing the entire German war economy, applying his considerable intelligence and organizational talent to maximizing weapons production and industrial efficiency with the same aesthetic perfectionism he had brought to architectural design. He was extraordinarily effective in this role, increasing armament production dramatically despite Allied bombing and resource constraints, demonstrating a capacity for systematic organization and problem solving that made him invaluable to the Nazi war effort, and that extended the war significantly beyond what would have been possible with less competent management. The psychological mechanism that allowed Speer to perform this role while maintaining his self-image as a cultured intellectual rather than as a war criminal was comprehensive compartmentalization, the rigorous separation of means from ends and of technical challenges from moral implications. When he thought about armaments production, he thought about production statistics and efficiency metrics and logistical problems about how to extract maximum output from available resources and how to overcome bottlenecks in supply chains and how to reorganize factories for optimal workflow. The weapons being produced were abstract outputs in his mind, disconnected from their ultimate use in killing and conquest. Just as the buildings he designed had been aesthetic objects, disconnected from their function as stages for Nazi spectacle and instruments of ideological manipulation. The use of slave labour in the factories and construction sites under his authority were approached with the same technocratic detachment, framed as a problem of resource allocation and productivity optimization, rather than as systematic exploitation of human beings, worked to death under brutal conditions. Speer dealt with Himmler and the SS to obtain concentration camp prisoners for labour projects, negotiated for access to forced labourers from occupied territories, collaborated with Fritz Sokol, who organised the deportation and enslavement of millions of foreign workers, and throughout all of this, maintained the internal narrative that he was simply managing resources efficiently, that the suffering and death of these workers was regrettable but irrelevant to his responsibilities, that his job was to produce weapons and construct buildings, regardless of what methods were necessary to achieve those goals. This compartmentalization was enabled by the bureaucratic structures that mediated his relationship to the human consequences of his decisions. He issued orders to subordinates who implemented them through additional layers of bureaucracy, creating sufficient distance between his decisions and their implementation, that he never had to directly confront the suffering those decisions produced. He visited factories and construction sites, but saw only production numbers and progress on schedules. The workers reduced to elements in logistical calculations, rather than experienced as individual human beings whose pain and exhaustion and desperation might have triggered empathy that would interfere with efficiency imperatives. The entire system was designed to allow people like Speer to function as moral technocrats whose considerable intelligence and organizational talents could be fully employed in service of atrocity without requiring them to acknowledge or emotionally process the reality of what they were facilitating. The question of what Speer knew about the Holocaust and when he knew it has been extensively debated by historians, and the evidence demonstrates conclusively that he knew far more than he admitted at Nuremberg or in his memoirs. He attended the Posen Conference in October 1943, where Himmler delivered his infamous speech explicitly discussing the extermination of the Jews, describing it as a glorious page in German history that would nevertheless never be publicly acknowledged. Speer later claimed he left the conference before Himmler's speech, a claim that documents and testimony from other attendees contradict. He worked closely with the SS on labour allocation and visited concentration camps to assess their productivity. He was intimately involved in the deportation of Berlin's Jews to clear housing for Germans displaced by Allied bombing. The architectural plans he continued developing for post-war Berlin included no provisions for Jewish residents or buildings. A population and community erased from his aesthetic vision of the future. What Speer achieved through decades of public performance and memoir writing was the construction of a false narrative that allowed him to evade full accountability while maintaining his self-image as someone fundamentally different from other Nazi leaders, as the reluctant participant who had been seduced by Hitler's charisma and architectural ambitions rather than by Nazi ideology. as the technocrat who had focused on his professional responsibilities rather than on the broader criminal enterprise he was serving. This narrative worked because it matched what people wanted to believe about intelligence and education and culture. The comforting fiction that someone with Speer's sophistication and aesthetic sensibility must have been somehow different from the thugs and fanatics, must have been trapped by circumstances rather than actively complicit in atrocity. At Nuremberg, Speer delivered a carefully crafted testimony that acknowledged collective responsibility for Nazi crimes while denying personal knowledge of specific atrocities, expressing regret for not having questioned Hitler's orders or investigated what was happening in the camps, performing a kind of confession that appeared honest while actually obscuring the full extent of his complicity and his active participation in using slave labor and facilitating genocide through his management of the war economy. The performance was sophisticated enough to convince the tribunal that he deserved imprisonment rather than execution, and sophisticated enough to establish the historical narrative that he spent the rest of his life reinforcing through memoirs and interviews. The psychological truth beneath this performance was that Speer had devoted his considerable intelligence entirely to the service of self-deception, had constructed elaborate rationalizations that allowed him to maintain cognitive dissonance without resolution, to know and not know simultaneously, to participate in atrocity while experiencing himself as a culture professional focused on aesthetic and technical challenges. His compartmentalization was so complete that he may have genuinely believed significant portions of his own false narrative, may have convinced himself that he had been ignorant of things he actually knew, that he had been powerless to influence things he actively facilitated, that he had been a reluctant servant rather than an enthusiastic enabler. Albert Speer's life and legacy reveal one of the most dangerous truths about how atrocity becomes possible in modern societies. That aesthetic sensibility and technical brilliance and sophisticated intelligence provide no protection against complicity in evil. That, in fact, these qualities can facilitate atrocity by providing sophisticated mechanisms of rationalization and compartmentalization that allow perpetrators to maintain self-concepts as civilized and cultured individuals, even while devoting their talents to systematic murder and enslavement. The architect who could design buildings of monumental beauty and the technocrat who could optimize production systems with brilliant efficiency was the same person who used slave labor without apparent moral qualms and who collaborated with the SS to obtain concentration camp prisoners for his projects and who continued designing a future Berlin from which Jews had been completely erased. The mechanism through which this moral blindness operated was the elevation of aesthetic and technical considerations above ethical ones, the framing of choices as questions of beauty and efficiency rather than as questions of right and wrong. When your identity is built around being someone who creates beautiful buildings or who solves complex organizational problems, when your sense of worth and meaning derives from architectural vision or technical achievement, when you've trained yourself to evaluate decisions based on aesthetic impact or productivity metrics, rather than on human consequences, you have created the psychological conditions that allow participation in atrocity while maintaining the self-image of the cultured professional simply doing excellent work in your chosen field. Speer's post-war performance and the success of his false narrative demonstrate another disturbing truth: that societies want to believe that education and culture correlate with moral behavior, that we collectively resist acknowledging that the most sophisticated and educated members of society can be enthusiastic enablers of genocide, because accepting this truth would force recognition of how fragile and unreliable the connections are between intelligence and ethics, between aesthetic refinement and moral clarity. The comfortable fiction that Speer was somehow different from other Nazi leaders, somehow less culpable because he was more cultured and intelligent, allowed him to escape full accountability and allowed society to avoid confronting the reality that technical and aesthetic brilliance can be devoted entirely to evil purposes by people who experience themselves as simply doing excellent professional work. This has been Forgotten Minds. Albert Speer died in 1981, having successfully maintained his false narrative for 35 years after his release from Spandau. Having convinced much of the world that he had been the repentant technocrat rather than the willing accomplice. Having preserved until death the carefully constructed self-image that allowed him to live with what he had done by denying the full extent of his knowledge and responsibility, proving that the most sophisticated criminals are often those who commit their greatest crime after the original atrocities have ended. The crime of rewriting history to preserve their vanity and evade the moral reckoning that genuine accountability would require. Until next time, stay vigilant.